I'm excited to come to you today to talk about different ways to boost your recall. I think too often this is one topic that gets really overlooked. We go to dental conferences, we go to different meetings where we learn about all different sorts of marketing techniques to bring new patients in the door. However, what's happening with our current patients? You've probably heard this saying before that you're sitting on a gold mine, and before you go out and before you look for new patients, you should probably be looking at the internal processes that you have in order to retain your current patient database. So all of this is in conjunction with a blog post that you can find where we really go through and we talk about 17 ways to boost your dental recall. I want to talk about the 80-20 rule here for a second. Again, as I said before, we often think that everything revolves around new patients and new patients coming in the door. But this 80-20 rule really comes into play when we think about how 80% of your revenue in your practice is from existing patients. And only 20% of that on a yearly basis is due to new patients. So 80% of your revenue comes from the patients that you currently have or that have been in your practice before. Now, this is very similar to the bucket with the holes mentality. You can pour water in a bucket all day long, but unless you've plugged the holes, it really does no good. You're really not going to grow your practice unless you really are maintaining what is currently in your bucket. And the same thing goes for your dental patients. The patients that you have, if you're not holding on to them, if they're not coming back into your practice, if you don't have good practices in place to ensure that you're not losing patients out the back door, then adding new patients and spending money on marketing dollars really does no good for you. There are two key performance indicators that are looked at when determining the health of your patient retention within your practice. The first one is called patient preappointment. So the patient preappointment percentage is looking at the number of active patients who have been in your practice within the last 18 months that currently have an appointment scheduled on the books. Now, this could be hygiene, this could be restorative, but it's looking at overall what is a percentage of patients that you have, active patients, that are planning to come back into your practice. Now, out of 3,000 practices across the country, the top 10% of them showed at 78%, which you think about that, there's still a huge room for improvement. The national average was at 64%. So again, this goes back to the bucket with the holes. If we can't plug those holes, if we can't hold on to those patients, that becomes really expensive. And the more we spend on marketing, it just goes out those holes. Now, the second key performance indicator that we look at is patient reappointment. So patient reappointment is what the percentage of patients that when they leave your practice, leave with an appointment that same day. Now, this becomes tricky because I know you've heard it a lot. The patient says, you know what, I don't know my schedule. I'll reach back out to you or I'll check back with you later. But we know that if they leave with an appointment that same day, that patient retention within the practice really skyrockets. So the top 10% across the country was at 91%, which is pretty good. Now, the national average sits at about 77%. So I want you to think about that. What are you doing to really keep your patient pre-appointment and your patient reappointment percentages as high as possible, making sure that every patient that leaves your practice has an appointment scheduled? Now, I want to talk to you about the 6-2-2 rule. The 6-2-2 rule is an indicator of how often and what the time period should be of when we're actually scheduling an appointment and when we're reminding and communicating with our patients. Now, this rule is that 6 months before their next appointment, or in other words, as they're leaving your practice, that you schedule an appointment with that patient. Now, I know for myself that when I go to a dental practice, I don't know what my schedule is going to be like 6 months down the road. And oftentimes, I kind of just want to see their response when they ask me, when can we get you scheduled? Sometimes I'll say, you know what, I don't know what my schedule's like. Maybe I'll reach out to you and let you know. Now, that is the biggest black hole in your practice with patients that are saying, I don't know what my schedule is going to be like 6 months down the road. So let me reach back out to you and I'll set that appointment with you. Now, if you've heard this before, you know that's a black hole. You know that patient is probably not going to call back. The best chance you have is to go ahead and set an appointment. So if they don't know what their schedule's like, you can use something. You can use some verbiage, something like, it's really hard. We actually often get booked up far in advance. So by putting you on the schedule 6 months down the road, even if you don't know what your schedule's like, what we will do is 2 weeks before your appointment, we will actually reach back out to you and just make sure that time slot that we set 6 months ago works for you. And if not, we'll be able to adjust it. Now, the other two, the 622, 2 weeks before, you're going to confirm that appointment. Now, whether you do that by phone, whether you do that by text, by email, 2 weeks before, you just want to make sure that we're confirming that appointment and that it works for that patient. And then the other two, the 622, the second two in there, is 2 days beforehand. So 2 days before, we don't want to confirm the appointment. We just want to remind them of it. Now, you might have some patients that maybe those problem patients that you know that you can schedule an appointment, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to either miss it, they're going to forget it, or you're going to have to reschedule them. For those patients, I might mark in your practice management system that those are the ones that maybe need a reminder the day of. So the rule 622, 6 months, 2 weeks beforehand, and then 2 days beforehand to remind them. And oftentimes maybe the same day, just to kind of send that last reminder out. Now let's talk about how you're actually communicating with your patients. How are you setting these appointments? How are you confirming them? And how are you reminding them? Today, if you're not doing text, voice calls, so actual phone calls and email, then you're probably only reaching a fraction of your patient database. So we recommend that you use text, voice, and email in order to confirm and to remind your patients. It used to be that practices could get by with just making phone calls 15, maybe even 20 years ago, but that's dramatically changed. Nowadays, everything is done on the smart device. When you're making purchases, when you're booking flights or hotels, or even you're calling an Uber and you're waiting for your Uber to come, everything and all the notifications all come on your cell phone. So nowadays, we're programmed to expect that our notifications, our reminders, everything is going to come through the smartphone, through the cell phone. And let me also just talk about how we're actually verbalizing, how we're communicating to our patients that we're calling to either confirm or to remind them of an appointment. Now, this can be the same verbiage that you use in text and email. I would highly recommend that you don't use the words, "This is just a friendly reminder," or "This is just a phone call to remind you of your appointment." It's never just. Instead, I would recommend using the terms or the verbiage, "This is an important phone call," or "This is an important reminder about your upcoming visit into our practice." That kind of changes the mentality that it's not just a text message that's coming in. It's not just an email that they need to respond to. This is critical for their oral health. So why texting? Why has texting become the number one means that patients communicate with their dental practices? Now, 95% of Americans own a mobile device. 77% of them actually have a smartphone, an iPhone or an Android. For the first time in history, the number of households that actually have a landline are actually less than those who have a mobile device in place of a landline. So now, most homes across the United States have mobile devices that they rely on for their means of communication instead of a traditional landline. So if you're not utilizing these smartphones and texting them in the way that they want to be communicated, again, we're missing the mark. Now, by all means, I'm not saying that texting and email is the only way that you should be reaching your patients. The phone is still very effective. However, we just have to think about when we're placing those phone calls, when we're reaching out to our patients. Now, traditionally, you come into the practice, you get in maybe 8 o'clock, 7:30. You'll probably wait to start making your phone calls until 9. And then you'll probably wrap up your phone calls around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the day. Now, personally for me, if you're calling me before 9 in the morning, I don't want to answer your call unless you're close family. That to me, that's my personal time. So in the morning, I would refrain from calling any patients before 9 o'clock. Now that block from 9 to 5, if you're calling patients, you're probably going to reach the stay-at-home moms or dads who aren't busy in the workplace. But if you're trying to reach the individuals that are in the workplace, that are busy during that time frame, your call now becomes intrusive. And that's why I like to refer to the text messages. Because if you're calling during that time frame, I mean, we're in a day and age now where the phone is different. We're actually scheduling our phone calls. We tell people when we're going to call them. We make sure that it's okay for us to call them. It's different than how it was before. And so make sure that you're calling at a time that is not intrusive to them. Another idea might be to call during the lunch hour. If you are going to make some phone calls, maybe between 12 and 1 o'clock, when they're out for lunch, maybe grabbing a bite to eat, that might be a good time to call them. But I might suggest something different. I think that the best time to reach your patients by phone is actually after business hours. But there's a small window that I think is a prime time to call, and that's between 5 o'clock and 6:30. So why that time? Well, for those working individuals, the 5 to 6:30 time frame, that's when they're going to be commuting. That's when they're in the car. And I know personally for me, that's when I make the majority of my phone calls. When I'm driving, I'm thinking about the day, got a lot going on, that's when I catch up on the phone calls that I've missed. So by calling during that time period, you're probably going to have a higher success of reaching the individuals that you couldn't reach during the business day. Now, 6:30, I would highly suggest cutting that off. Anything after 6:30, now you're just eating into family time. You're eating into the time where they're having dinner with their family. And after that, now that's just kind of risking it. I mean, now you're looking at really upsetting people. I know for myself, about 2 weeks ago, knock on my door, 8 o'clock, maybe 8:30 at night. My porch light was off. I mean, I had checked out for the night, wasn't expecting anyone else. 8:30 at night, I'm wondering who could be knocking at my door. So I go to the door and there's a salesman. That late at night, I didn't even give him the time of day. I just shut the door right on him. I know I'm a bad person, but make sure that you're not calling too late into the evening. But again, that prime time between 5 and 6:30, you might want to arrange for someone in your office to either make calls outside of the work hours, stay late, whatever that might be. But if you're relying on the phone, make sure you're thinking about when you're placing those phone calls. And finally, what about offering some sort of incentive for your patients to keep them coming back every 6 months? Now, personally for me, my dentist offers a whitening program that if you come in every 6 months for your appointments and that you're not overdue, you don't miss your appointments, that you will be eligible for free trays and for free whitening. Now, to me, that's huge. I love that. And I make sure that I am there every 6 months and that I don't miss that. So offering something to your patients to incentivize them to make sure that they keep coming back, and maybe reminding them with some sort of an email newsletter or even a mailer to let them know about that you offer free whitening as long as they are coming back consistently into your practice. Now, this might not be a fit for all practices, and you're going to have to kind of figure out what kind of incentives will work for your demographics, for your area. But these are great ideas to make sure that patients are engaged and to keep them coming back. These are just a few tips and tricks, a few ideas of how to boost the recall within your practice. Thanks for joining us. My name is Mike Buckner. Make sure you tune in for additional videos coming soon. Stay classy, Santiago.